I want to welcome everybody to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, July 14th. And before we start with the topic for tonight, I want to say a couple of things concerning something that happened before Biden got to Saudi Arabia, Israel, Saudi Arabia, etc. He had a discussion in the White House, in the Oval Office, with the President of Mexico, López Obrador, and it was covered by Bloomberg. Richard, could you mute? We're getting background to you. And so what happened was that there was a 25 to 30-minute lecture given by the President of Mexico to the President of the United States. And what he talked to him about was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He said many things to him. This is covered, actually, by the way, by Bloomberg. But in the course of their discussion, he told the president that there are a lot of Americans that keep coming across the Mexican border to buy gas because it's $1 cheaper. And the way that Bloomberg covered it was to say that AMLO included an offer to double the gasoline supply to border gas stations for American consumers, which he explained could help his U.S. counterpart while lawmakers consider Biden's call to suspend fuel taxes at a time of galloping inflation and economic uncertainty. Now, right now, the price of gas in the United States is averaging $44.66 per gallon. In Mexico, the average price is $3.12. However, it's also important to recognize that in California, there are people paying $6 and $7 a gallon. There was no positive answer from Biden. In fact, what Biden did after appearing to sleep through much of the talk was to assert to AMLO that the United States was preeminent in the world in its economic recovery. But it's a useful story to tell in order to understand that there are powers in the world that are very aware of what the actual condition is in the United States and with respect to the dead end that faces neoliberalism in the United States. And people are very concerned about it. They're very concerned about also the problem of how the continued pursuit of those neoliberal policies may very well end up putting the world into thermonuclear war. One of our long-standing enemies, but someone who's known us for a long time, Noam Chomsky, was interviewed. The interview was only published yesterday. I'm not quite sure when it occurred. It was published on Truth Out, and it was called Noam Chomsky Says, Humanity Faces Two Existential Threats. One is merely ignored. And as the interview begins, Chomsky says this: before turning to the important issues raised, we should keep firmly in mind one overriding concern. The great powers will find a way to cooperate in addressing today's critical problems, or the wreckage of human society will be so extreme that no one will care. All else fades alongside of recognition of that fundamental fact about the contemporary world, very possibly the last stage in human history. It cannot be reiterated too often or too strongly. So, again, his point is the great powers will find a way to cooperate or there will be nothing. So the specter of an assertion of attempts to win a war against Russia, for example, as are being expressed continually by the United States administration right now, are not only foolish, they could lead to thermonuclear war. One of the things that Chomsky and others have made clear, at least in their estimate, in the past week or so, is that the most likely way that thermonuclear war will occur will be by accident. not by calculation. And therefore, there's something to be said about trying to figure out what the conditions are that confront humanity when you're looking at this question of nuclear war. Matter of fact, there are some experts or other people who've bothered to take the time to do the calculations that state that the United States president or his counterpart in Russia have approximately 6 minutes in which to decide whether or not an attack is real or not. So if you have not spent years building up trust among those powers, if you get a circumstance in which, or a situation in which, that you have a false, that is accidental, apparent launching of thermonuclear war, then that lack of a reservoir of trust could end up creating the conditions for a near extermination, if not extermination, of the human species. So when we are looking at the present world and we are confronted with the idea that various Americans and others are trying to ignore the danger and the power of the danger of thermonuclear war because it's not their business, because it's not their issue, we want to realize that what they're doing is leaving it to the inclination, or for that matter, even the informed judgment, but of a Biden or someone equivalent to decide whether or not humanity is blown up. And so this has to be taken seriously in a much different way. All electoral politics and other politics is very important, of course, but that won't solve it. It's really the citizenry becoming involved on a different level, and in particular understanding the true history of the United States on these matters of war and peace. Now that last point inevitably involves Lyndon LaRouche because of the negotiations that happened in 1983 or culminated the 1983 proposal by President Ronald Reagan of the Strategic Defense Initiative, something that was initiated by Lyndon LaRouche. And then, as we indicated in the couple of paragraphs that were written by Richard Black for tonight, that from April of 1994, 11 years later, LaRouche was involved again in discussions with Russia, but these were not back channel as they had been earlier in 1982. These were public discussions, and there were people who now wanted to engage LaRouche publicly, and he spoke at many different locations: Russian Academy of Sciences, the State Duma, and other locations. So what we're looking at now, that was, of course, nearly 18 years ago, and Mr. LaRouche has passed away as of February 12th of 2022. But over the course of particularly the last few years, the LaRouche organization and its representatives have been involved with a kind of an open dialogue, and we've been encouraging that open dialogue with Russia, China, other nations. But specifically on this question of the danger of war, attempting to develop some sort of basis, a coincidence of opposites, if you will, through which this can be remedied. So we wanted to make sure that this got actually discussed in this context tonight because of many of the predicates of the danger, which we will perhaps go through during the course of the evening. But whether we do that or not, the real thing that's important is to understand the indispensable nature of what Lyndon LaRouche did and continues to do via his organization to create a rational basis for the idea of peace. Development is the name of peace, but then it has to have a content, not merely be a slogan. So to discuss this, and to discuss also the relationship of Russia and China, both themselves and Russia and China to the United States, we have Richard Black. Richard is doing our work representing the Schiller Institute, in particular at the United Nations, and so he's here to talk to us about this tonight. So, Richard, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dennis. Is my volume okay?
Yeah, it's very good.
Okay, I have to apologize for my scratchy voice to your listeners. I came down with a cold this morning, but I think we can get through it. So as Dennis said, I'm going to discuss tonight how LaRouche's essential ideas, fundamental discoveries, shaped Russian policy, specifically over the past 30 or so years, and are continuing, as Dennis said, to shape it day by day today. It was 28 years since LaRouche first, from today, arrived in Moscow in 1994, and this was at the invitation of the very renowned physicist, economist, chemist, biologist, Dr. Boris Kuznetsov. And what they discussed at a series of meetings, which were recorded and published, was LaRouche's design for a new international monetary system. At the time, Russia was being crushed by the London boys and the University of Chicago boys and the Harvard boys with the insane shock therapy privatization of the entire Russian economy. And what LaRouche put forward was both a design for a new and just international monetary system and also a new educational system to provide young people with the classical education to allow them to be nation builders. Those ideas that LaRouche first put forward, as Dennis said, in the United States to the Russians in 84, and then beginning in person in 94, those very ideas are the topic of government-to-government planning sessions today in Eastern Europe and in Asia. China is a separate case, which I won't discuss tonight, but China's entire economic planning is based upon measuring the rates of technological innovation in the economy as a whole. They've designed a series of economic tools, one of them called the Innovation Capacity Index, with 18 indices measuring the rate at which advances in science are propagated through the Chinese economy, through the machine tool sector, and through the education and the development of a higher and higher skilled labor force. This is the content of the current 5-year plan in China. This is a topic for another evening. But currently, today, Russia, under threat of, as Dennis said, nuclear war by NATO, what is being discussed in Asia is a new set of relations, entirely new set of relations between nations based upon a shift out of the speculative money-chasing economy into an economy of industrialization, of science, and moving out of simple raw materials extraction. In a word, a science driver, an industrial revolution. And this, for sure, is what's going on in Russia today. And as I think you'll see, LaRouche's ideas over the last decades have directly impacted the intelligentsia of Russia. Back to the present for a moment. This spring, there has been an amazing pace of discussions of the launching of a new non-dollar monetary system based upon the productive forces, agriculture, industry, science, of the nations of Eastern Europe and Asia. And leading individuals who are leading the discussion conceptually have been long-term collaborators, public collaborators with Lyndon LaRouche and the Schiller Institute and LaRouche's representatives. In the middle of March, the Russian economist Sergei Glaziev held, and his team, he is an executive of what's called the Eurasian Economic Union, involving 5 nations in Eurasia, Russia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, a few others. Glaziev held a meeting of his team with the team of Dr. Wang Wen from the Shanghai Institute of Financial Studies in China. And what they discuss is that the current Western liberal monetary system is collapsing. It will lead to nuclear war And what they're responsible to do is to launch a new system based initially in Eurasia. This was in March, and this was a private meeting, although there was some very minor press coverage of this. Come April, there was a meeting in Moscow, excuse me, which is a group called the Sparrow Hill Group. And at this meeting in Moscow were Chinese representatives, plus leaders of the Russian Assembly, the House, the Duma, in fact, the deputy speaker of the Duma, leaders of various party factions in the Duma, bankers, scientists, industrialists. It was an all-day session, and again, what was the topic? How do we advance and implement a new non-dollar monetary system? As you know, the dollar is seen by most of the world now as toxic. Come May, there was a public meeting of what was called the Eurasian Economic Forum. Again, Glaziev played a key role, and what was quite extraordinary at this meeting of the Eurasian Economic Forum, excuse me, was that the head of the much larger Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, now that includes Russia, China, Pakistan, and India. The head of the SCO spoke at one of the panels, and he said, if we can unite the small Eurasian Economic Union and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and we must unify, we could change the entire world system. Now, this was the first time that the SCO had publicly acknowledged this new process in formation. And then, of course, as most of you probably followed, this past month in June was a meeting of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the BRICS Plus, with about a dozen nations, Argentina, Egypt, other major nations, Indonesia, who are in various ways negotiating to be partners, allies, collaborators with the BRICS to do what? Well, ask President Putin of Russia. President Putin, for the first time, announced that there are discussions underway to form a new international monetary system. And of course, those of you who have followed LaRouche's work over the years know that in 1971, when the connection between the dollar and gold was severed and floating exchange rates were set up, making the value of currencies not determined by sovereign governments, but by the speculators, LaRouche outlined in 71 the need for a completely new international monetary system. So President Putin last month, for the first time publicly, added his voice to this completely historic dialogue. I think you could think of the period from 1994 to the early 2000s as the decade of LaRouche in Russia. As I said, in 94, right after LaRouche was released from the railroad sentence that kept him in prison for 5 years, LaRouche meets with the intelligentsia at the Russian Academy of Sciences, people of all kinds of various expertise, mathematics, biology, physics, etc. And this begins an extremely intensive dialogue, which became broader and broader within Russia. In 2001, the same Sergei Glaziev I mentioned before, the brilliant economist, he was at that point a member of the Duma and the chairman of the Economics Committee. He invited LaRouche from America to come and lecture on the causes of the collapsing Western monetary system and the outlines for a new system. In the room were not just all the members of the Duma Economics Committee, but about 100 scientists, bankers, academicians, and it was widely covered. I think the Moscow Times, the way they covered it, they said it was something. I think the headline was LaRouche expects greatness from Russia. So that was 2001. By 2007, LaRouche's proposal, Helga's proposal, of a world land bridge, a Eurasian land bridge, and specifically uniting North America and Eurasia with a Bering Strait tunnel, this was given major discussion at the highest levels in Russia, and LaRouche attended in person and by video a series of conferences, again, at the very top of the Russian industrial scientific elite. And then, I wanted to indicate to you a bit of the tremendous insight that the Russian leaders had in what LaRouche was putting forward. In the year 2000, LaRouche was running for president for the Democratic nomination, and 15 Russian scientists wrote an endorsement of his presidential campaign. This is in the year 2000. And here's the open letter which they wrote. Dear Mr. LaRouche, with great interest and agitation, we are following the presidential campaign in the United States and your own participation in it. Despite the well-known obstacles thrown up by your opponents and the mass media that are faithful to them, we are well aware of your high standing among American voters. That standing is no accident. In our view, people such as you, Mr. LaRouche, best match the spirit of our times. The people who come to power now should be highly competent political figures who are capable of undertaking to solve extraordinarily complex social, economic, moral, financial, and political problems. Through personal contacts and acquaintance with your scientific writings and your political speeches, we have gotten to know your profound erudition, the precision of your analysis, your sharp mind, your intolerance of phoniness, your high level of scientific honesty, and your ability to put forward original ideas and find constructive, sometimes unexpected solutions and recommendations. Like no one before, you have succeeded in uncovering the harmony and interaction of rigorous science and classical art forms, as well as uniting the methods of scientific discovery and the education of youth. To this should be added your great human daring, strength of will, and confidence in your powers, as well as the ability to overcome the dangers and misfortunes which all manner of ill wishes and foes have attempted to so generously heap upon you. It is difficult to imagine what the cost was to you in nervous energy and health of those undeserved 5 years behind prison walls, inspired by former President Bush and his entourage for political motives. We think that you, Mr. LaRouche, are the one capable of directing your country onto the path of progress and prosperity for the American people, and for the sake of all the people of the planet. We hope that American voters will make the right choice by voting for you as the future president of the United States. And it's signed by 15 scientific leaders. I won't go through the names. We wouldn't recognize them now. But directors of various sections of the Russian Academy of Sciences, different teachers, pedagogical colleges, renowned individuals, editors of publications, a somewhat breathtaking array. And you can see from the quality of their thought that they were shaken up by being introduced to Lyndon LaRouche. Rather than going through a chronology, which would take more time than we possibly have, I want to mention 5 scientific laws of physical economy, which LaRouche has defined as necessary for progress. They are, and then I'll go back to them, the nature of national sovereignty, the role of a science driver in a sovereign national economy, the development of a metric for scientific progress, LaRouche's famous potential relative population density, LaRouche's unique definition of a common word, misunderstood by most, infrastructure, and the proposal for a worldwide land bridge connecting all the continents by high-speed rail, and the necessity of giving to our young people classical education in both scientific method, physical science, and in the fine arts. These 5 areas, which one could call laws of the noosphere, from LaRouche, were seized upon by the Russian intelligentsia in a very spirited and energetic way. On the question of the sovereign nation state, LaRouche wrote many articles about the heart of Russia, the identity of Russia, over its 1,000-year existence since the Christianization of Russia 1,000 years ago. LaRouche, the way LaRouche put it in one major article, he said, the definition of Russia's role as a nation of science, is an essential integral feature of its nature and efficient historic role as a sovereign nation-state personality at this juncture in world history. That's from an essay in 2001. And this is, LaRouche developed this in great depth, that just the way we understand a sovereign individual, me, you, or friends, or associates, as sovereign entities, sovereign monads, so it's the case that a nation with its culture derives its sovereignty from its activity, from its world outlook, from its contribution to world culture as a whole. And this is something which, to this very day, when I speak with ambassadors from Russia, they always go back to the question, well, we in Russia are a sovereign nation. And that cannot be said about most nations, which are being so crushed by the collapsing monetary system today. What Glaziev said, this was in February of this year. He gave an interview. This is a translation from the Russian. How is Glaziev thinking? What is he proposing? I would like you to get to the inside of what they're debating behind closed walls. He says, this is Glaziev in a TV interview in Russia, what is required of the central bank today? Special refinancing instruments, that is, credit lines for targeted investment projects, for import substitution, for government guarantees, if you like, for special investment contracts. All of this to fill idle production capacity. Give enterprise earmarked loans, 2 to 3% per annum for 3 to 5 years, and they'll flood our country with a huge amount of goods. What we cannot produce on our own, we will do in cooperation with China, and by building production chains within the Eurasian Economic Union. And at the meeting that Glaziev was talking about, the leadership, who was there? The leadership of the Russian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Council on Industrial Development, and Russian Economic Competitiveness. And one of the things that was reviewed was a research paper, well, this is interesting, from 2015 to 2017, called The New Industrialization, Now or Never. This is written by sections of the Russian elite. This was all the way back in 2015, 16, 17. The question of LaRouche's very specific principle that every sovereign nation must have a science driver. This is something that was discussed in many of the seminars with LaRouche by Professor Kuznetsov, as I mentioned. He said, the production of new creative ideas is the driving force of economic growth. This results both in the increase of material well-being and of an increase in the intellectual power of the human species. On the question of LaRouche's discovery of potential relative population density. This is a discovery that captivated the Kuznetsov group, and in a Moscow journal, widely read in 1994, at the end of the year, LaRouche was in Moscow in the spring. This was in December. Kuznetsov wrote the following: "Let us introduce the physical magnitude of LaRouche, designated by the term La. This gives the number of persons who can be fed from 1 square kilometer or 100 hectares during 1 year. We share LaRouche's view that the magnitude of potential relative population density can serve as an indicator of intellectual culture." And you see the dialogue between LaRouche and these leaders, the question of the moral and intellectual development of the citizenry and the productivity of the economy are one and the same thing. And so this was a major topic of discussion. Infrastructure. In the United States, you talk to people about infrastructure, it's like talking to people about buggy whips. They almost don't know what it is. No high-speed rail, collapsing highways, collapsing cities, virtually no new nuclear power plants, fusion energy massively underfunded, on and on and on. LaRouche's concept of infrastructure is very specific and becomes elucidated in the proposal of Helga and Lyndon LaRouche of the World Land Bridge. In 2007, there were intensive discussions with academician Alexander Granberg, who headed up something called the Council for the Study of Productive Forces. He was an expert on all of Siberia, all of Eastern Russia. He was probably the senior expert on the development of Russia's East. And this study of the productive forces, this commission was the follow-on to a similar commission headed up by Vladimir Vernadsky, the KEPS organization, as it was called. He worked most of his life, Granberg did, in Novosibirsk. Some of you may know about this. So Granberg was a tremendous champion of the proposal, also championed by Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, to build a connection between the U.S. and Russia across the Bering Strait. In 2007, we attended a conference organized by academician Granberg. It was called, the Russians always have long names for these conferences, Mega Projects of the Russian East, a transcontinental Eurasia-America transport link via the Bering Strait. And LaRouche presented a paper called The World's Political Map Changes. Mendeleev would have agreed. So there was after this major conference, which was widely publicized in Russia, Alexander Granberg was in Moscow with LaRouche at a memorial for a leading economist who had just passed away. And here's what he said about this project and LaRouche. Quote, "Here is the story. 3 weeks ago, there was a conference in Moscow on one of the mega projects, namely the construction of an intercontinental route from Eurasia to America across the Bering Strait. This is a very old idea, to link the continents and the entire rail network of the world. Sooner or later, this project is going to be built. Many generations have dreamed about implementing this project, and this conference today took place, the one that occurred 3 weeks ago, with the active participation of our government and of regional governors, and the idea, I can tell you, has gained support. One of the speakers at the conference was introduced as a representative of Mr. LaRouche. 3 weeks passed, and here today is Mr. LaRouche in person. there's been an opportunity to discuss what actually needs to be done to push this project ahead. These are very encouraging views. This railroad will be built. Thus, you have already taken part in this project. By the year 2027, according to the schedule, it will have been completed. Maybe just a bit of the tunnel will remain to be built across the Bering Strait. It's only 100 kilometers. I hope to be able to have some influence on the design of this crossing. And we will try to name the station closest to the Bering Strait tunnel on the Russian side, either Stanislav or Menshikov. That was the name of the brilliant economist and LaRouche ally who had passed away. And this conference was in commemoration of his work. So Gromberger goes on. Yesterday, with your forecast, Mr. LaRouche, we were talking about a lot of numbers, but I'm talking about a living, breathing station, of national importance, and named for you. And then Gromberg's wife, who's on the podium, adds, and on the American side, there will be a station named after LaRouche. So this was 2007. Quite extraordinary. Lastly, on this question of youth and the absolute necessity of a pedagogical method based on Socrates' method, the Platonic dialogues, the method of hypothesis. This was discussed at that 1994 first colloquium led by Kuznetsov. I think this was a several hour really debate between LaRouche and Kuznetsov, who were getting to know each other philosophically. At the very end, LaRouche sums up with a few words, and then there's, I think, an indicative comment by one of the scientists, and I'll end for you there. LaRouche said, therefore, we need a global crash program for some good purpose, which will give us the technology which, through investment, can save mankind from a disaster. I will conclude with the following observation, even though it is not complete. We could go on for weeks with this. Not only is this view of technology and the mathematical significance of this kind of notion of technology sound scientifically, but we have come to a point in man's history at which this concept is a practical concept essential for human survival. And therefore, I am enthusiastic about the so-called President program, of which Kuznetsov is the leader, our host. And then one of the scientists adds a comment, which I think is quite telling, of the way in which LaRouche's most difficult, challenging writings have been studied in detail, in concept, broadly since the publication of LaRouche's book, So You Wish to Learn All About Economics in Russian, which I think was either in the late 80s or the first months of the 90s. So this is Dr. Alexeyev, and I'll conclude with this. He says to LaRouche, this meeting today has made a tremendous impression on me. I am speaking not only for myself, but for the school children in clubs in Moscow who study space. Your book, So You Wish to Learn All About Economics, in Russian translation, is one of the subjects we studied, introducing the children to broad studies of space. My fifth graders made golden section constructions using this book as a guide, following your wonderful idea, which is on page 61, about the golden section. Also, your presentation of self-similar spiral development is brilliantly, simply, and easily grasped by children from the 5th to the 9th grades. Using a straight edge and a circle, they construct the golden section. They construct logarithmic spirals. They study the rhythmic characteristics of sound. They rediscover the elliptical orbits of the planets in our solar system. We find an enormous intellectual potential in these children. I would like to say that I am very impressed by your proposal, and that the knowledge we are exchanging here and the work proposed by Pobisk, Georgievich, Kuznetsov be made through our activity a joint project for teaching children. A joint project for teaching children. I have another concrete proposal for which I request just 3 more minutes of time. Pobisk, Georgievich spoke about the blind, deaf, mute children whose intellect our Russian scientists inculcated, who learned to draw, to invent fairy tales, and in those drawings and fairy tales by blind, deaf, mute children, my children, educated about the golden section according to your book, find the rhythmic characteristics of the golden section, negentropic processes, and the alphabet of the musical scale. As a concrete proposal, I'd like for an electronic mail connection to be set up as soon as possible between the scientists of Russia, represented here, and those American scientists, represented by you, who stand for negentropic scientific interests. Then we will be able to exchange and share ideas with you, as well as possibilities for children to grasp ideas by Occam's principle, whereby we approach the idea of the golden section directly, without prolonged theoretical discussion. Thank you so much for your book, and the hope that we may have further creative collaboration among our scientists and organizations. So I'll end there.